Are we live right now? Are we live?
Okay, so one of my new favorite podcasts is a podcast called Unregistered by
Mm-hmm.
Thaddeus Russell. And Thaddeus Russell was a lecturer at, um, oh God, college right across the street from Columbia. I'm blanking out on its name.
Yeshiva?
Women's College, no, right across the street from
Oh,
Columbia. Uh,
Not Sarah Lawrence.
no. Crap.
It starts with a B.
It does start with a B.
Brandeis.
This is bad.
Brandeis.
No, not Brandeis. The Women's College right across the street from Columbia.
They all look the same to me.
Are you Googling this?
I am.
Okay, and then I'll start over.
Barnard.
Barnard, that's right. Okay, so one of my new favorite podcasts is a podcast called Unregistered with Thaddeus Russell, who is a history teacher. He's taught at Barnard. Some famous kind of fallout story where he didn't get a tenure track position, so he ended up leaving the university. He wrote a popular book called A Renegade History of the United States.
Oh, yeah.
But his goal with this podcast is broadly to talk to people who have things to say that shouldn't be said. Right? So he's talked to, for instance, Maggie McNeil, who's a prostitute and a sex workers' rights advocate. He's talked to Camille Foster, who's a black anarcho-libertarian or anarcho-capitalist who doesn't identify as black. I'm blanking out on the first. Sorry?
No, I'm said wow to.
No. His first interview was with Michael Malice, who wrote Dear Reader, an unauthorized autobiography of Kim Jong-il. One of the things he's questioned is this idea that the university itself is neoliberal, or can be usefully described as neoliberal. And one of the things that I know you work on is neoliberalism. So I would like to spend some time, if we can, unpacking that particular notion. What is neoliberalism? We'll just talk about it broadly, and then maybe we'll come to its application to the modern university.
Yeah, that's a good. I mean, this is a good question. Neoliberalism is mostly an economic concept, and it is largely. I mean, we can, lots of humanities, and I will talk about it from a humanities viewpoint because that is what we both are. And neoliberalism is largely seen as the continual privatization of the public sphere since especially the election of Margaret Thatcher in the United Kingdom and Ronald Reagan in the United States. Although, of course, it begins far before that. Lisa Dugan argues that neoliberalism is largely the dismantling of New Deal policies. So the point in the 20th century where United States cultural life as well as economic and political life really shifted was during the New Deal and subsequently World War II. And we see at the mid-century following that, a large expansion of the state, a large expansion of what is considered the public. So you see, service members returning from the war theaters in Asia and Europe, going to college on the GI Bill. So you see the huge expansion of public and private universities actually, but especially public universities. And then you see the founding of lots of government agencies from, through the next few decades, from the I'm blanking out, from like the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency under Richard Nixon, to we could argue to the Department of Homeland Security, and just the expansion of the state in general. From what was formerly during the Gilded Age and kind of the pre-World War One era, especially, no, we had a fairly limited government. That's arguable, and fairly limited public sphere. But following World War II, and especially following the New Deal, we see the expansion of that formerly limited state. So neoliberalism then really occurs in the 1980s and throughout the 1990s and continuing on today as the undoing of that expansion. So we see the two major political parties, the Republicans nominating and subsequently electing Ronald Reagan, who largely privatizes as many government organizations as he can, and begins slashing budgets. And then the development of third wave Democrats. And this is largely seen through the election of Bill Clinton in 1992. So basically neoliberalism is just the privatization of what had been made public. And there are lots of nuances from that we could go into, but that's the basic definition that I think most humanities scholars who work on neoliberalism could agree on.
Okay, so let me just drill down on a couple of points here. So when you say neoliberalism, the neo refers to a resurgence of liberalism, by which I suppose you mean kind of classical liberalism.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it seems like the danger that if we just take Reagan, because I'm not a Thatcher expert, but the danger one risks in attaching that definition to Reagan is to turn him into any sort of classical liberal, which by most measures he wasn't. I mean, this is a man who did some slash budgets in order to return massive amounts of control to local governments and private citizens, as much as he shifted it to fund military, as far as I understand, and who ultimately ended up raising taxes rather than lowering them. I mean, there's a fairly pernicious deification of Reagan that happens ubiquitously on the right, to which the left is frequently pointing out, the mythology of.
Yeah.
But I mean, it doesn't seem to be the case at the end of the day that Reagan was a classical liberal.
Well, no. So I mean, there are a couple of things there. So
because let me just clarify. Because there's a difference between Reagan saying, and this is a paraphrase, right? The scariest thing is to hear somebody say, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help," or something like that. And the actual implementation of policy on the across the 8 years of his presidency.
Yeah. So I think there's a couple of things there. I mean, one is the definition. So we can see the prefix of neo working in a couple of ways. We can see it being, and this would be the what people I think would normally think of as the use of neo as that prefix in front of liberalism as purely a continuation of liberalism or a reimagination of classical liberalism. Whereas I think what it actually comes to mean for most of us working on neoliberalism in the humanities is not only a continuation, but a reimagination of classical liberalism. So something that isn't necessarily, I mean, it's working in that way like the modernism-postmodernism divide. So postmodernism is not only like a continuation of modernism, it's a like retooling of it. It shares some things with modernism, but it also reacts against modernism in a lot of ways. But post is a little easier to understand maybe because post implies what comes after. Whereas neo just seems like it could be like a purely new form of classical liberalism, and that's not exactly the case. So I think what neoliberalism does is takes this value this rhetorical value of valuing free markets and enterprise and free trade,
Mm-hmm.
and builds a state around that value. And this is
Okay.
largely why, I mean, the military machine that Reagan builds, I mean, that really had been building since World War II, when Eisenhower talks about the military-industrial
Sure.
complex and warns us against that. Um, the military complex that Ronald Reagan really builds, and Bill Clinton or H.W. Bush continues, and Bill Clinton certainly builds, and George W. Bush certainly after 9/11, we beef up the military complex again, and Barack Obama is, I mean, perhaps I would argue the most neoliberal of any of these presidents, who is able to both strengthen the military and imagine it in new technological, frightening ways. But largely, this military complex is built and deployed around the world to protect free trade and protect free markets. So when I mean, we can look at the overly simplistic leftist rallying cry around when Bush 2 W declares war on Iraq, and
Mm-hmm.
people start saying that this is a war purely for oil. Whereas people
Mm-hmm.
on the right are saying, no, we're spreading democracy around the world. Well, neither of those
Mm-hmm.
is purely true. We are doing both in a way. Ironically, going in and killing hundreds of thousands of people to make it a peaceful place, supposedly. But we are motivated to do that because we have a business interest in having friendly allies and friendly states in the Middle East, largely because of oil, but also because of water rights and other things. So that is largely why you actually, in many ways, see the expansion of the state on some levels under neoliberalism. So you see the expansion of the military complex because it's needed to guarantee free trade and free markets
Mm-hmm.
internationally,
Mm-hmm.
which is a value of classic capital L liberalism. But I would say this is where neoliberals are getting classical liberalism wrong.
So just to clarify, your understanding of neoliberalism in a place like Iraq is
Hmm.
the military. It, it it allows us to understand what happened in Iraq as the military intervention in the Middle East in order to open up and secure markets for trade, largely for corporations like Halliburton
Yeah, yeah,
or
absolutely. And BP and
okay, so it's a
Exxon.
war profiteering machine.
Yeah. I mean,
Okay,
this is nothing, like, this is not really a new concept.
right. So right, yeah. I mean, I have two questions, and one just goes back to the sharp differentiation between neoliberalism and classical liberalism, which I guess I'll come
Hmm.
back to in a second. But then, yeah, I'm just not convinced that war profiteering is anything. There's anything neo about it. Um, I mean, war is the business of the state. It's a good business,
Right.
and lots of people make money off war. They always have.
But there's a big difference though between, if we're going to look at the conflicts that we get involved in during the 20th century, let's say,
Hmm.
into the 21st. So let's start with World War II, which we enter A because Japan attacks Pearl Harbor, and B because we see the atrocity. We are beginning to see, although we were blinded, knowingly blinded to it for a long time, the atrocities against innocents being done in Europe.
Okay.
So we largely in we then largely subsequently credit World War II with helping to take the United States out of the combined with the Great Deal or the New Deal, taking us out of the Great Depression. So it's a money making engine, but I don't
Hmm.
think making money is necessarily the reason that we get into World War II, even though it could certainly be one motivator. but it's still not the primary motivator. Korea and Vietnam are kind of the rumblings of what we know as neoliberalism, which is to say these are
Mm-hmm.
both wars that we get involved in largely to stop the spread of communism,
Mm-hmm.
unsuccessfully in both cases.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where the tides really start to turn. And those were largely, especially Vietnam, I mean, obviously very unpopular wars.
Mm-hmm.
Then we have in the 70s an energy crisis in the well, a worldwide energy crisis, but it is really heavily felt in first world or industrialized but non-oil producing countries like the United States and Great Britain specifically. And so this is largely why we, throughout the 80s and the 90s and into the new millennium, start turning our attention to the Middle East. And these conflicts that we take part in, whether it's either Iraq War or many of the other conflicts that are happening on a smaller scale, whether it's Clinton's interventions into Somalia in the earlier 90s, are largely being done to both stabilize as much as we can economies in the Middle East, in the greater Middle
Mm-hmm.
East, and to secure our own interests there, which are largely we are, it's American and British companies building and consuming oil.
Sure. Okay.
So it becomes more explicitly conflicts about economics and about free trade and
Okay, but then it
keeping markets
seems
open.
that. Oh, go ahead.
No, that's fine.
Well, I was gonna say, then it seems that opponents of neoliberalism would be fairly ready allies with classical liberals or libertarians who almost entirely oppose military intervention,
Yeah,
usually for most reasons, but certainly for the creation or guardianship of markets.
I
Yeah, I
mean,
mean, I can't think of someone who identifies as a classical liberal and simultaneously argues that we can use the American military to open up new frontiers of trade. That's
maybe Andrew Sullivan.
usually regarded as antithetical to a non-aggression principle.
No, I would agree.
Say
I
that
mean,
again.
I would say maybe Andrew Sullivan is an individual that, I mean, there is a certain type of breed. There actually, I would say they're more neoconservatives,
There's a
actually.
little neoconservative breed, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
But so, and I think you bring up an important point, which is that, and this is where I'm interested in problematizing the ways humanities scholars
Say that
talk
word.
about neoliberalism. I know you don't like the word
Mm-hmm.
problematize as a verb. But because I think it's far more complicated than humanities scholars often, especially earlier in their careers, we oversimplify neoliberalism. And it usually comes, well, I don't want to say usually, but it often in conference papers or in books, but especially probably in dissertations and early career articles, comes to mean just kind of like a ubiquitous placeholder for something we don't like that's happened over the
Sure.
last 30 years. But actually,
Well, I would say specifically the anything related to capitalism or markets that's
yeah,
had an effect that you don't like is deemed neoliberal.
right.
Right.
And I think, I mean, a lot of that critique is fair, I think. And you probably disagree with me on that, but I think
Mm-hmm.
that, one of the things that often goes unexamined is people like me who lean very progressive left, wavering to like some acceptance of neoliberalism. I'm certainly not a radical, but I'm a fairly progressive leftist. To people like you,
Well, hold on. Okay,
okay,
hold on. Let me just stop you right there because something you do that I'd never heard anybody else do is embrace. That might be too strong, but at least acknowledge that you are sympathetic with ideology, however that might be defined. Usually when I hear neoliberalism, actually almost every other time I've heard people deploy the word neoliberalism, it is as an epithet.
Yeah.
And it is something that other people are, people who, to some degree, right, whether they are conservatives or libertarians, show some admiration for capitalism. So neoliberalism becomes a pejorative, right? It's kind of inherently pejorative that is used to distance oneself from that political ideology, from a more market positive
Yeah.
political ideology.
I mean, do you want me to talk about that? Like why?
Well, I mean, part of what I guess I'm getting to is whenever somebody uses the word ideology, I don't have to scratch too far beneath the surface to find a socialist, if not like a strong welfarist. It tells me something inherent about their anti-capitalist politics or their anti-market politics. Right, and they might not be Marxist awaiting the revolution, but they certainly have a tendency to view markets as more pernicious than beneficial, or more alienating than uplifting. I'd hazard to say, I can tell a lot about a person's politics or their attitude towards economics and markets based on whether the word neoliberalism is part of their vocabulary.
Yeah. No, I think that's fair. And in graduate school, this became. Well, hold on. Let me text my leader, Kim Jong-il, and ask him what he wants me to say here. No. So one of the problems one of the frustrations that I had in graduate school was exactly what you bring up. And actually, I think like this is partially the nexus of our friendship, like in its earlier nascent stages. Was I got really just frustrated with this everyone throwing around neoliberalism, and I don't think that like I find it curious that lots of kids in English literature programs are doing this, and B, it just wasn't like a specific enough term to describe anything beyond signaling that you had a certain type of or that one has a certain type of politics. Or ideological belief system. So one of the things I actually really, even though he's far more to the left or radical than I am, and certainly than you are, I really like David Harvey's Brief History of Neoliberalism. And one of the things that like I really latched on to, yes, has a beautiful picture of my girlfriend Maggie Thatcher on the cover. God, I love her. So one of the things that he says in there very early on, and that is one of the better books about neoliberalism from a humanities perspective, I think. I would recommend him and Lisa Dugan, Twilight of Equality. But I think one of the things that one of the things that he says early on is that we can imagine neoliberalism in two ways. Either as a dystopian project to undo the public, and to redistribute wealth upwards. And that is the definition, or that is the reasoning that most humanities scholars, I would say, have latched onto. Or we can imagine neoliberalism as a utopian project to more equitably distribute wealth, which is to say that we can imagine that the foundation of neoliberalism is this goal to spread out wealth and bring up quality of life around the world, and certainly for our own citizens. And I actually think but I guess the neoliberal belief ultimately is that can be done through capitalist structures, which is largely why humanities scholars, I think, largely reject that utopian notion of neoliberalism. And I think, to be fair, this is where the divide between like neoliberal Republicans comes into play against neoliberal Democrats, which is to say that I think largely when neoliberal Democrats, and maybe I'm laying my cards out a little too early here, but like I think when neoliberal Democrats try to spread free markets through diplomatic or military interventions, it is at least with some positive ideology of we want life to improve for other people. And I think that's at least a generous notion, if not also a little bit, what's the word I'm looking for? When we act, I mean, it can be a little bit, not a little bit, it's a lot demeaning when we say, we know how you best can live, people around the world. And I think, the figureheads of this in the more contemporary era could certainly be both Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, who I agree with on a lot of policy issues. But does that difference make sense, though? The utopian-dystopian divide, which I...
Yeah, I mean, and I'm just looking at this from a more classically liberal perspective, from which that utopian vision of neoliberalism is fallacious too, because the kind of neoliberalism that you described is more recognizable to me as corporatism or a massive corporate welfare project or some sort of project of doling out sectors of an economy to private corporations, which is not certainly not a form of capitalism I would even think of as capitalism, but that could be a different discussion. Certainly not the kind of capitalism that I would want to claim as capitalism, and certainly has no utopian ends as far as I'm concerned, because the only thing such a project could lead to is a massive gap between the rich and the poor, and a sharp consolidation of wealth at the top. So, yeah, I mean, I view this a little bit differently as a more classically liberal person who is interested in protecting people's right to trade voluntarily for their mutual betterment. But that has very little to do with governments doling out projects to corporations or opening markets through the force of their military or nation building. It actually has nothing to do with any of that.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I guess one of the things I think about how nobody, either whether it's people on the far right or the far left or classical liberals like yourself, nobody is necessarily willing to think about. And I mean, when I write about neoliberalism, I largely, as a cultural studies person, I look at and think a lot about consumerism and aesthetics. And I think that a lot of the things that we have today, we wouldn't have without the neoliberal project, which is ultimately impossible to know. But like, I don't think we have, without neoliberal policies in the United States and abroad, I don't think we have the interconnectivity that we so enjoy today. We don't have the ability to record this podcast, which largely comes from military technology. I mean, almost all computer and internet technologies come from the military, or from the hard sciences connected to the military project. And I don't think that we have any of that without neoliberalism. And I think that is something that people like yourself in the classical liberal vein, or people who are more radically leftist than I am, often fail to see, or disagree with me on. I mean, and I also think that we just have the spread of information and knowledge, and there are lots of positive things that I think come out of the neoliberal project, even if there are also lots of horrible things, which, of course, the war machine that we've created is the biggest example.
Sure.
Yeah.
So what does this have to do with the modern university?
Ooh, that's a good question.
I am frequently told that I work at a neoliberal university. Well, that I can't help but work at the neoliberal university because the university is now a neoliberal institution.
Right.
What does that have to do with Pinochet?
Your favorite political leader.
my, my,
So whereas I
he's the
pledge
picture
my
right outside
allegiance
the
to
frame.
the
That's
Kim
right.
Jong dynasty, Will pledges his allegiance to Pinochet.
Well, right, because histories of neoliberalism often start with
Right.
The Pinochet dictatorship, right, and Pinochet being surrounded by a group of advisors, the Chicago boys who learned from Milton Friedman, etc. Right, as if there's some sort of, as if Friedman's ideas are massively bastardized when instituted by a dictatorship. But
Right.
that's a yeah, okay. But what is this? Tell me about the university.
So, I mean, one of the concepts that we didn't really get it because I was trying to focus on the purely political and economic nature of
Mm-hmm.
neoliberalism and emergence of neoliberalism. But the thing, and this is actually where I find I'm really confounded, and often confused by neoliberalism and discussing it. I mean, I think this is largely. We can probably look to, of humanities scholars, we can largely look to probably Wendy Brown the most to see this thought about and played out, the idea of the neoliberal university. It's where we are putting purely economic terms and approaches into action in spheres that were formerly thought of in non-economic terms. So, I mean, of course, universities have always had budgets and have always thought about that.
Sure.
But through the explosion of universities and colleges and more people going and going into higher education, we have seen the huge expansion of these entities, which were formerly fairly small. And at the same time, we have seen a transference of how we think about universities and how they're structured to more business models. And so we think of university presidents and deans and other administration officials more as company presidents and CEOs and CFOs. I mean, some universities even, title these certain positions as chief financial officer or chief information officer. So it's just, I think when we say the neoliberalization of the university, we largely just mean the corporatization or the mock business nature that's been put into university structures since the 80s, really.
Mm-hmm.
But especially in the 90s and into the 21st century.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, maybe a better, more tangible example of this would be we can see a more consumer-driven model for thinking of students not as mentees or advisees or apprentices, but thinking of them as consumers. And so one of the things that we're constantly told to do is to give consumers what they want. So if we think of students coming into our classroom as if they are customers coming into our restaurant, we're afraid that if it's a restaurant, they're going to leave us a bad Yelp review. If it's our classroom, we're afraid they're going to give us a bad teacher evaluation. And so many things are based around teacher evaluations, at many schools, tenure and promotion, but also teaching awards and other accolades, or even the ability to get a tenure track job in academia, or non-tenure job for that matter. So yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, those just seem two arguably different phenomenon. On the one hand, you've got a military-industrial complex uh, forcibly opening up and protecting markets overseas and growing in the United States comparatively in order to protect against threats real and mostly imagined. At the same time, you've got a creeping business discourse
Mm-hmm.
within the modern university. Largely, I think, as a
Why do
result
you see
of
those as completely separate phenomenons, though?
well, one's a military-industrial complex
But remember,
phenomenon built
why
around.
why are we expanding that military-industrial complex? It's because first and foremost, what is most important?
Okay, I see what you're saying. Yes,
Yeah,
okay, I see. Yes,
is
okay.
in I mean this is part of, and Lisa Dugan really like explains this out really in depth and really well. I think like we think of everything in life, whether it's relational life, we think of marriage. I mean, when we were expanding marriage to homos like us, for instance, you are married, I am not. Um,
Normal.
we not normal. So
I know what you're saying. I'm trying to play devil's advocate, but not too eloquently. But keep going.
well, just that. I mean, we largely a lot of arguments around expanding marriage rights were expanding tax benefits and expanding healthcare access and insurance
Mm-hmm.
to same-sex couples, and so that's largely thinking of what has always been thought of as a fairly well, that's not true actually, but I was going to say that we haven't always thought of marriage in economic terms, but actually, as you have written a book about, there's a
Yeah.
very long
Mm-hmm.
history of
Mm-hmm.
that. But it was very explicitly
On sale now.
Fordham
Keep
University
going.
Press. Get Will some royalties.
Mm-hmm.
But we largely argue, or not largely, but well, yes, largely argued for the expansion of marriage in economic terms. We largely use the military for, at the end of the day, economic projects. The university is first and foremost concerned in in our critical eyes for the bottom line and for pushing students through as happy consumers as quickly and as cheaply as possible. Um, Sometimes not always
So
cheaply,
I
but
think you and I have a lot of common ground here in
yeah.
terms of analysis or identification of the problem. I think and this is to get back to the split between opponents of neoliberalism who would use the word neoliberalism in the first place, just as
Hmm.
as part of their discourse, and neoliberals, be they libertarians or anarcho-capitalists, um, who would certainly sympathize with you in terms of a criticism of the military-industrial complex,
Hmm.
and might often agree with you that there are areas of life that should not be thought about purely in terms of profit and loss. For instance, taking a history class. The rub comes, I think, or the tension, I think, between these two groups, though, comes in the solutions. Well, there actually may be a very similar solution when it comes to the military, because I think we can all
Yeah,
just agree to defund it. Right? Chop its
absolutely. Which
budget
is
by
partially,
2/3
I
and
mean,
see who
not
invades us.
to throw this in. So, I mean, where I went to school, George Washington University, um, Rand Paul is about to teach a class, and I don't really want to like get into all the politics about that, but I mean, I think that this is a very good example of if there is somebody on the right that I feel like those of us on the far left or who are anti-violence could agree with, it's libertarian-minded Republicans like Rand Paul. Like I certainly agree with Rand Paul on more than I agree with Paul Ryan, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, that's neither here nor there.
Thought you were more of a Jeff Sessions fan.
Oh my God. He can hit it any day of the week. Will Bottom for Sessions.
No, though. I guess he's Attorney General now. Never mind. Okay, he's down to Congress.
I really don't like Jeff Sessions. That is not true.
I'm just kidding.
I know.
But if we can agree on a goal, right, towards decreased military spending and bringing and shrinking the American empire and bringing the troops back home and whatnot.
Tie a yellow ribbon round the old oak tree.
What what would you argue for in terms of the university, in terms of working to detach or to create a space within the university for something more than a calculus of profit and loss, which is very hard to do because college is expensive and students see it for very good reasons as a path towards a career. And students are not generally interested in having their time wasted. But yet we have this kind of 4-year albatross that we keep struggling to make. Well, I mean, there's no reason it has to be 4 years, right?
Yeah.
There's no reason we have to do this the way we do it. But, and it keeps getting reconfigured in order to justify. Well, let me put it this way. I think the modern university is under pressure to justify most of what it does that does not have immediate career implications. So if I want to go in and get a degree in accounting, the accounting department doesn't have to do much to justify me taking courses in accounting, right? It's clear I want to be an accountant. The university does, though, have to work to justify why I also need to take a class in biology, why I simultaneously need to take a class in Western Civ, why I simultaneously need to take a class in fundamentals of philosophy or logic or something, right? That's what I mean by the albatross.
Yeah.
And I think the more expensive college becomes, the heavier the burden of justifying the existence of a general curriculum becomes. And I don't know how to. In terms of solving that problem, you and I might have very, very different solutions.
I don't know that we actually do, because I think so. One of the things I was listening to a newer podcast, newish podcast that I quite like now, called Pod Save America from Crooked Media, which I just think it's funny and engaging and thoughtful and smart. And one of the better progressive podcasts out there. And today they had on one of Minnesota's 2 Democratic senators, and I'm going to butcher her last name.
Minnesota.
Amy Klobuchar. I don't know how to pronounce her last name, so I'm butchering it. But we'll just say Senator Amy K.
Okay.
And one of the things that she was talking about was we're just sending too many. We're culturally sending and asking for too many people to go to college who don't need to go to college. So we need to train people for a wide array of jobs, and a lot of these jobs don't require a 4-year degree. They require a 2-year degree, or they require a 1-year degree or training. And I think that is largely the solution. And I think that both happens from the business world or the private sector, in realizing that your employees will be happier if they are not burdened with unnecessary student loan debt for the rest of their lives. And from colleges themselves, raising admission standards and raising continuation within college standards. It's a beastly phrase.
What are continuation within?
So, like, saying that you have to pass and, like, pass certain, making it more academically rigorous. So, does that make sense?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it's a bit, given the way that education currently functions to signal equipment for employment, I think it's a bit, and the way that 4-year colleges especially dominate the higher education market, I think it's a bit unrealistic to say that, like, businesses, which are very disparate, will all suddenly kind of get together and start searching for different employment signals. I mean, part of the reason that so many people go to college when they don't need to is because we culturally encourage them to, and this happens in the high schools
But isn't
as
that what I
well.
just said? That
I'm not disagreeing with you on that
okay.
part. I'm not disagreeing with you on that part. But also, for as expensive as college has become, and as burdensome as the debt, the college debt often is, Milton is yawning, the money is very easy to get. And all things considered, it's very cheap, right?
Right.
So it's cheap, free money. Not free money, it's cheap, easy money.
Yeah.
And
it's deceptively cheap.
Sure. But where you and I might depart is, my interest to rein in the spending of other people's money in college tuition as a way of discouraging people who have other aspirations from going.
Didn't I just say that though? I mean,
You did not. You did not talk about public. You did not talk about tuition dollars, student loans.
Okay, well, I mean, but I think if we culturally shift the attitude, first of all, I take issue with you're just saying like that's too hard or that's naive to think that we need to like culturally shift and get businesses like.
I agree with you culturally, but I don't think that businesses are all going to get together and say we need to start looking for new signal mechanisms. I think that needs to start in the high schools.
Well, right. I mean, all I'm saying, the only thing that I think we differ on is that, like, I think both sides of the equation. I don't think that this is purely an educational problem. In fact, I think it's largely a private sector business problem that all these companies are requiring college degrees that don't really need them. And you see certain sectors actually starting to lead the way and because they're realizing that their employees don't need 4-year degrees. So like the tech sector is a really like common area now where you see people not with traditional college degrees, but who are self-taught coders or hackers, like your son. So I think it's a both. I just think that it's a both and solution. I think that you're seeing it as like we need to defund public education largely on the higher level, and I'm seeing it. I actually think that's the more impossible project and not a good project. So we have a very long, nearly since the founding of this country. I mean, your own alma mater, University of Virginia, UVA, is one of the oldest public and still one of the finest public universities in this country. And I think it is much easier to have a cultural, societal, attitudinal shift in thinking that everyone needs to go to college than it is to undo public colleges in general.
Yeah, well, I mean, I have other reasons for wanting to defund government schools, most of which go back to stealing is wrong. But I'm not surprised that we have a strong cultural mandate to go to college when the state has such a large hand in both elementary, secondary, and higher education, right? The state just kind of encourages people to go all the way through. I don't find that surprising. So I would, and I don't have like a policy solution here beyond, maybe we need to make the money needed to go to college what is the phrase?
Harder to get.
Bankruptcy. Harder to get, higher interest rates.
Yeah.
To discourage people, right? To send a signal that maybe this is something that you don't want to do, or maybe you shouldn't do. Maybe this is a burden you don't want to take on.
And I think that this is part of what we like are flailing our arms about, sometimes without like much substance, but because we're upset about it. But I think, there was so much when the 2008 market crash, there's so much talk about the real estate and the like loan and banking sectors making that crash happen. And so much like subsequent like government intervention and policy developed
Hmm.
to alleviate that problem or to exasperate it, depending on how you approach it. But there wasn't. I mean, there was some legislation and some talk, but not nearly the amount of talk about. If we think of like subprime mortgages as being predatory for
Hmm.
in the housing market, which I think throughout the 90s and 2000s they were. I mean, I don't understand why we don't think of student loans in the same way. Like, I think student loans are also really predatory.
Oh, sure.
I think we agree on that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, no, no. Right. The goal is to get them early, right? To get the students early and to saddle them with huge amounts of debt, which again they can't discharge to bankruptcy,
Right.
right? You end up presenting them with ostensibly cheap and
Mm-hmm.
easy money that they don't realize will become such an extreme burden.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I guess what I was trying to get to is like the free college proposal, but that's probably another conversation. I'm actually being called to come up and do dishes, so I'm going to have to go.
By your
But
son? He wants to spend time with you?
by my husband,
Oh, I love Howard.
I know. Yes, I was trying it not very eloquently to suggest the free college proposal by suggesting that we take away college loan money.
Well, let's start there next time. Because I
Okay.
actually think like we've
Okay.
gotten to summarize what we've gone through today. Like we've gotten through like, okay, so what is kind of like some of the basic definitions and thinking of neoliberalism around humanities scholarship or within humanities scholarship, and then like how does that begin to affect the university? So next time
Hmm.
we'll focus on the neoliberal university. In
Okay.
you. That's where I want to go. Ooh.
Goodbye.
Bye. I love you.
Love you too.